Picture a successful hunt, and then picture the clock starting. The animal is down, the group is fed, and there is far more meat here than anyone can eat tonight. In 2 days, in warm weather, most of it will be dangerous. So the celebration is also a countdown. This is the oldest problem in human eating, and for hundreds of thousands of years, there was no solution. You ate what you could, you left the rest, and you went out and did it again. Think about what that actually meant, lived out across a lifetime. It meant that food had no future tense. A good day could not be saved for a bad one. Your ancestors regularly experienced enormous abundance and genuine hunger within the same month, sometimes within the same week, and there was no mechanism to move the first into the second. The feast rotted where it lay. The famine arrived anyway, right on schedule, indifferent to how well the hunting had gone the month before. Everything you managed to acquire had to be consumed almost immediately, or it turned, on its own schedule, into something that would make you ill. And the reason it turned was invisible. We know now what was happening. Bacteria and other microorganisms living in and on the meat, multiplying steadily and producing waste as they go. But bacteria need something specific to do that. They need water. A microorganism lives in liquid, feeds through liquid, and reproduces in liquid and flesh muscle. Fat, organ is mostly water. A carcass in warm air is essentially a warm pond, and it fills up with life within hours. Nobody could see any of that. There were no microbes in anyone's picture of the world. No theory of decay. No germs, no spoilage science, no explanation of any kind. There was only the observed fact, repeated endlessly across every generation. Meat left out becomes poison, reliably, always, in a couple of days. So the solution, when it came, could not possibly have been reasoned out. It had to be stumbled into. And what your ancestors stumbled into was this. Pack meat heavily in salt, and it does not rot. The mechanism is genuinely beautiful, and it explains why almost nothing else available in the ancient world worked half as well. Salt pulls water. Put a high concentration of salt against wet flesh, and osmosis takes over. Water is drawn steadily out of the meat, and out of the cells of every living thing inside it. The tissue dries and firms. The bacteria that were about to bloom find themselves sitting in an environment with nothing left to drink, unable to feed, unable to divide, unable to do anything at all. The meat isn't cleaned, exactly, and it isn't sterilized. It is made uninhabitable. That is an antimicrobial technology, invented and used for thousands of years by people who had no concept of a microbe. They could not have told you what they were killing or that they were killing anything at all. They only knew with total practical certainty that flesh packed in salt was still good weeks later, and that the same flesh left alone would have been long gone. So where did the salt come from before anyone was mining it? In the simplest cases, it was lying there waiting. Along certain coastlines, seawater collects in shallow depressions in the rock. The sun works on those pools through a long hot season, and what remains when the last of the water has gone is a crust of pure white salt sitting in the open air for anyone to pick up. Inland, there are springs that carry dissolved minerals up from deep rock and leave pale deposits ringing the ground where the water surfaces and evaporates. And in some places, salt occurs as rock outright, in seams and domes pushed up and exposed by erosion, hard and obvious and available to anyone who happens to walk past it. None of this required invention. It required noticing, and then, crucially, noticing the second thing, which is the observation the entire story turns on. Not simply that this strange white substance existed and tasted sharp and good, but that things left near it behaved differently from things left anywhere else. That a fish abandoned on a salt-crusted rock at the edge of the sea was somehow still a fish days later, firm and edible, while an identical fish, left on ordinary stone 20 paces away, had long since become something nobody would touch. Somebody, somewhere, made that connection. And once it was made, it would have traveled through a group, and then outward from that group with astonishing speed, because unlike most discoveries, it did not need to be argued for, or explained, or taught in any depth. It solved a problem that every single person already had. It could be demonstrated in a week, and the demonstration was undeniable. Now, follow what that unlocks, because the consequences run much further than dinner. The first is that surplus becomes real for the first time in human history. Before preservation, a large kill was a windfall you had to spend immediately. After preservation, a large kill is an investment. The meat from one good hunt, salted and dried, can feed a group across weeks. Through a stretch of bad weather, through a period when the herds have moved, through the lean end of a season, when nothing is fruiting and nothing is easy to catch. The hungry gap between abundances stops being a thing you endure and becomes a thing you plan around. That single change alters the entire relationship between effort and safety. It suddenly becomes worth working harder than today actually requires, because for the first time in human history, the extra effort doesn't simply evaporate overnight. You can bank it. In a world where everything rots, there is no reward whatsoever for producing more than you need. The surplus is not wealth, it is just meat you will watch spoil, and the rational move is to stop as soon as you have enough. In a world with salt, the calculation inverts completely, and doing more than the day demands becomes the most sensible thing a person can do. The second consequence follows directly, and it's bigger. You can stay somewhere. Mobility, for a forager, is not a preference or a lifestyle. It is a requirement, and one of the main forces driving it is the simple fact that food will not wait. You move because the resources move, because the herds shift, and the fruiting season ends and the fishing changes, and because you have no way at all to carry the good times with you when you go. Everything you cannot eat today is left behind, which means the landscape is always dictating the terms. Stored food changes that equation from the ground up. A group holding weeks of preserved supplies suddenly has a reason to remain in one place through a season that would otherwise have driven them out of it, and a reason to invest labor in building something more substantial than a shelter meant to be abandoned in a month, and a reason to accumulate the sort of heavy, awkward, valuable possessions that nobody who moves constantly would ever bother to own. Permanence becomes thinkable. Preservation is not the only thing that made settled life possible. Agriculture is the enormous part of that story, and it deserves its own telling. But you cannot have a settlement of any kind without some way to hold food through the stretches. When the surrounding landscape provides nothing at all, a place you cannot leave is a place you must be able to eat in year-round. Salt is one of the things that made staying put survivable rather than fatal. The third consequence is distance. Fresh food cannot travel. It has a range of roughly a day, and then it becomes a liability rather than a supply. Preserved food has a range measured in months. Salted meat and salted fish can be carried across a continent, loaded into a boat, taken somewhere that has never seen the animal it came from. Food stops being strictly local, and the moment food can move, everything else follows it. Because a group carrying a month of supplies can go places that a group eating day-to-day simply cannot reach. And salt itself becomes one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world for exactly this reason. Not because it is rare in any absolute sense. The sea is full of it, and there is more salt on Earth than anyone could ever use. But because it is distributed with brutal unevenness, some regions have it lying on the ground in quantities beyond any local need. Others have effectively none within hundreds of miles, and every single person in that second category needs it constantly, without any possible substitute. That is the perfect shape for a trade good. Universally required, impossible to do without, and available in only some places. Salt moved along established routes for thousands of years, carried on the backs of animals and people across deserts and mountain passes, and the routes themselves became permanent features of the landscape. Roads that existed because of salt, some of which are still roads today. Settlements grew where the routes crossed. Places that happened to sit on a source became wealthy far out of proportion to anything else they had. And rulers taxed it everywhere, relentlessly, for a very simple reason. A substance that every household must buy, and no household can refuse, is the easiest thing in the world to tax. You do not have to chase anyone for it. Salt taxes have been generating resentment, smuggling, black markets, and outright revolt for a very long time, in a great many places, precisely because they fall on everyone. and cannot be avoided by going without. Which brings the fourth consequence, and it is the largest one. Ships and armies run on food that outlasts the journey. This sounds obvious, and it is worth sitting with because it is a hard constraint that shaped the limits of the possible for thousands of years. A voyage of weeks or months requires provisions that will not turn in a warm, damp hold, and salted fish and salted meat were exactly that. The fuel of long-distance seafaring for most of recorded history, the thing that made it physically possible to sail beyond the point of no return and expect to arrive alive. An army marching through a season needs the same thing, and needs it in enormous quantity. A force operating far from friendly fields cannot forage its way through hostile or empty country indefinitely, and preserved rations are what allow it to try. The reach of any campaign was set, in the end, by how long its food would last. So every long voyage of exploration, every extended military campaign, every sustained movement of a population across a distance, too great to feed itself along the way, sat directly on top of preservation technology. The map of where humans could go was drawn by how long their food could hold. Look at the shape of all four consequences together, because they share a single quality. Surplus, settlement, trade, and range are not four separate gifts. They are four expressions of one thing: the ability to hold on to food after the moment of getting it. That is what salt actually did. It did not preserve meat. It preserved time, took the value of a good day, and made it available on a bad one, weeks later, somewhere else entirely. Every human structure that depends on stored surplus, which is very nearly all of them, is downstream of somebody working out. That flesh packed in salt does not rot. So when did ancient humans first start eating salt? The honest answer is that people have been taking in salt for as long as there have been people, because it is dissolved in blood and meat and water, and it is unavoidable. But the question that matters is different. It's when humans stopped merely encountering salt and started using it, and that shift from a substance you swallow to a substance you wield is one of the quiet turning points in the whole story. It happened before writing, before cities, before agriculture in many places. And it was enormous. Now come back to your kitchen. Open the fridge and look at what's in there. Something cooked 3 days ago. Something bought last week that's still perfectly fine. Almost nothing in that box is racing you. You have never once looked at food and calculated how many hours you had before it became dangerous, and you have never in your life thrown away a week's calories because there was no way to hold on to them. That safety is not natural. It is a machine, humming quietly in the corner of your kitchen, doing continuously and invisibly what salt once did with enormous effort, holding the line against the same bacteria, in the same battle, using cold instead of dryness. And that's why salt fell so far. It didn't become less useful. It became less necessary, replaced by refrigeration, and canning and freezing, and a supply chain that delivers fresh food from anywhere on Earth in any season. The strategic substance that decided where cities went and what routes armies took got demoted to a shaker on the table, sitting next to the pepper, so cheap it isn't worth counting. Your ancestors spent thousands of years learning to defeat time with a handful of white crystals. You defeat it by closing a door. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, and about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.